After a tense year of trade relations, among many other differences, the U.S. and Turkey now seem to be heading towards a more agreeable path. Less than a week after the U.S. cut by half tariffs on Turkish steel, Ankara has responded by reducing duties on 22 U.S. products destined for the Turkish market. But was it a truly reciprocal move? When the U.S. announced its tariff cut, it also removed Turkey from a favorable trade policy. Known as the General System of Preferences, or GSP for short, it was established in the mid-1970s to help developing nations boost their trade prospects. But now, the U.S. says Turkey's level of development renders its inclusion in the deal void. Despite Turkey's removal from the GSP, economic ties between Ankara and Washington do seem to be heading towards a more cooperative direction. Recently, Turkey reportedly closed its ports to Iranian oil, coming in line with the U.S.'s renewed push to isolate Tehran. Turkey's full compliance, despite initial misgivings, will allow it to avoid U.S. sanctions. And it was the very sanctions and tariffs that the U.S. just scaled back that sent relations between the two countries into a tailspin last year. The punitive measures were imposed on Turkey to force the release of an American pastor who had been detained on terrorism charges. So it's not just Turkey and the U.S. that have seen volatile trade relations this past year. Global trade wars are raging. To see where that leaves Turkey, I'm now joined by Bozkurt Aran, who is the director at the Economic Policy Research Foundation in Turkey, and he's also a former Turkish ambassador to Switzerland, and by Jian Gao, who is the Secretary General of the Shanghai Academy, a think tank and research institute based in China. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Good to have you on Straight Talk. Mr. Jian, let's start with you. Before we get into the specifics, let's talk about the bigger picture. With the U.S.'s withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a renegotiation of NAFTA, and then a looming trade war between the two of the world's largest economies, are we seeing sort of a repositioning, a redefinition of a post-World War II trade era?
This is really a grand subject, actually. I agree it's a big picture because it's a possible trade war between the first economy power and the second economy power in the world so far. And however, I don't think it's a very clear shift from the post-war strategy, infrastructure of the world order into the possible new world order. Because actually China's side is very clear, by all means, in defense of the world order, as China benefit a lot, and as China is going to cater for the tendency of globalization, which determines the picture of the world order so far.
Okay. Ambassador, I want to get you in. When we talk about trade wars, obviously business is just one side of it. There are tariffs, there are restructuring of trade agreements. These all have a spillover effect. What do you think the repercussions are on global politics?
Well, let me start with the first question, I suppose, if you let me.
Okay, I'll give you a follow.
The system, the international liberal order, has been in place for 7 decades. And 12 U.S. presidents have been the champions of this system. And all of a sudden, with the administration Trump, it has started to change. Is it only because he has a different idea? Or is it because the whole system is, the globalization has come to its ends? That needs to be answered. It is, in my view, the technological rivalry that really imposes this kind of a rift between two major countries, China and United States. So this order will stay here, and would China be the champion of the existing system, or that US is about to abandon? So that's the question. Well, for me, I think the existing technological drive of China is quite serious. And they are quite important when it comes to artificial intelligence, computing, and autonomous cars. And so this rift would be would create an uncertainty that will stay for some time.
Because of the ongoing trade war between the United States and China, do you see other countries sort of picking up the slack? Do you see countries like Turkey maybe sort of stepping up and maybe filling in some voids created by this war?
Well, I mean, that's of course a small sidekick of the rift. I mean, when there is tariffs imposed on Chinese exports to United States, then of course Turkish investors, Turkish entrepreneurs could have a free way to go. But if the system collapses, if the system is under strain, then we all lose, including China, US, and all the countries involved. At this right moment, I feel three spheres: US, Europe, and China on one side. So the system will be defined again in coming days. And the old definition, let's say, the established order of 7 decades is under question at this time.
Mr. Jian, you said that China's position was clear. With these three superpowers coming, at each other in terms of trade, do you think that it needs to sort of maybe take a step back and reevaluate its position, its tactics, and how it approaches world trade?
I think national development is a very basic human right for any nation in this world. So this is our part of sovereignty for any nation in the world to develop itself economically, politically, and culturally. I want to say that you say there's a clear distinction between China and America. I would like to say there's a clear distinction between the past and the future. What I'm going to say is that, you see, there's really a difference between China and America on a lot of subjects, like China in support of multilateral cooperation, America in support of unilateral cooperation. China call for deeper open policy, America call for close nation, build wars against Mexico's. So you can see that if there's a distinction, I would like to say it's not America versus China, but I would like to say America versus a kind of tendency in the world. For example, more than 70% of the growth in the world economy is by the developing countries, not the developed countries. And half of the percent of the GDP is going to be made by the developing countries. So there's a growing tendency, which is obvious. So I like to say, if we have a kind of colliding sides, let's see, pro-historical tendency and anti-historical tendency. I would like to address it in this way.
Okay, now that we've solved this trade war between the United States and China, let's actually turn our attention to a developing country, Turkey. We've seen some interesting developments between Turkey and the United States recently. Last August, extra sanctions were put on by tariffs. In this past week, they've been taken off, reduced by half. But also, Turkey has been stripped of its preferential duty-free status with the United States. Talk to me about the timing and why you think it comes right now.
Well, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, I mean, the way the United States is dealing with the WTO, they have submitted a paper a few months before this decision was taken. And in that paper, they claim that Turkey is a developed country. They said that Turkey has developed 25 times when it become part of the system. So these kind of extra benefits is not required by the Turkish economy. Okay. And the number is not that big, and so we should not be.
But in terms of timing, do you find it any significance it coming right now, possibly right before the S-400 missiles defense system deal comes into effect in the coming months?
Well, I cannot say no. I mean, I suppose the country would use any kind of leverage they have towards the other country that wishes to bend to its needs, not the needs, the needs, I should say. I think it is a big probability.
Okay. Mr. Jian, you talked about... Go ahead.
If I'm going to bring the problem into a broader sense, I would like to say, talking about WTO, talking about globalization, it's not like a bilateral conflict. We'd like to look at it into the global perspective. Right. What I'm going to say is that we should call for inclusive, innovative globalization at the interest of all participants, instead of like one country's interest first, the other follow. This is very much unfair and unequal. This is old-fashioned, actually.
Okay, so in that global perspective, you talked about China's sort of multilateral approach in terms of trade. Talk to me about sort of the potential with countries like developing countries like Turkey and a trade powerhouse like China.
would like to say that trade problem or trade perspective is only part of the culture or the history of a certain nation. And talking about every culture, every country has its advantages as well as its disadvantages, has something good at and something not good at. So what we should do is that try to build up a multilateral cooperation platform so as to all the participants could make full use of their advantages in exchange for the goods for the better future in this nation.
Gentlemen, it seems that cooperation and multicultural approach to world trade seems to be the way to go. Mr. Jian Gao, Ambassador Aran, thank you very much for joining us here on Straight Talk.